The first Federation assault fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system with the calm confidence of a force that had never truly been challenged, their commanders reviewing projections that predicted Earth's total capitulation within 48 standard hours. Because every prior encounter with developing species had followed the same pattern of panic, surrender, and submission, and the Federation had cataloged humanity as fragmented, politically divided, technologically uneven, and emotionally volatile. A species that argued with itself more than a plan for external threats, and so the fleet's arrival was announced openly, with no attempt at concealment, massive ships sliding out of faster-than-light transit in perfect formation, broadcasting demands in hundreds of translated languages that boiled down to a single message that Earth was now under Federation control for its own stabilization and long-term resource management, a phrase that had preceded the quiet extinction of dozens of other civilizations. Yet on Earth the reaction was not panic but silence, a silence that unsettled the alien observers who watched global communication networks light up not with chaos, but with tightly controlled military traffic, as defense satellites shifted orbits with deliberate precision, and deep space sensors adjusted focus not on the Federation ships themselves, but on the subtle gap between them. In underground command centers, people like Admiral Jonathan Pierce stood with hands clasped behind his back, listening as analysts confirmed what had expected, that the Federation had brought overwhelming force by their standards but had failed to mask their energy signatures or encrypt their command relays beyond what human systems could already interpret. And Pierce said nothing for a long moment before quietly authorizing Condition Iron Veil, a status that only existed in classified doctrine and had never been activated, while across the planet heads of state were briefed in secure rooms by representatives who did not ask for permission, but informed them that planetary defense had moved beyond political debate. Because when the first Federation kinetic probes entered Earth orbit as a demonstration strike and vaporized an uninhabited stretch of ocean, the response did not come from surface weapons, but from a network the aliens had never detected, a layered lattice of autonomous platforms buried in orbital debris fields and powered by systems that emitted no continuous signature. And when those platforms awakened, they did so without ceremony, disabling the probes mid-trajectory with precise bursts that left no debris large enough to track, an outcome that caused visible confusion on the Federation flagship, where Fleet Marshal Karath demanded immediate explanation from the sensors, only to be told that the enemy defenses appeared to exist and not exist at the same time, a report he dismissed as incompetence, ordering a second wave that was larger and faster, because overwhelming force always corrected anomalies. Yet this wave vanished as well, not destroyed in a dramatic display, but quietly neutralized, stripped of guidance, and drifting uselessly into solar orbit. And only then did Earth respond directly, broadcasting a single message on an open channel that every Federation officer could understand, delivered in calm, even tones by a woman identified only as Defense Coordinator Laura Mitchell, stating that the Federation had violated sovereign space, that Earth had no intention of joining any external authority, and that further incursions would be met with proportionate response, a phrase that meant something very different in human military language than it did in Federation doctrine, because proportionate did not mean equal. It meant sufficient to end the threat permanently. And as the Federation commanders scoffed and prepared their main fleet elements for orbital bombardment, they failed to notice that human vessels were already moving, ships that had never appeared on any extrapolated model, emerging not from Earth, but from positions throughout the inner system where they had waited for decades in cold standby, crewed by people who had trained their entire careers for a war they had hoped would never come, but had always known was possible. And as those ships accelerated on vectors that exploited gaps in Federation formation theory, Admiral Pierce finally spoke again, his voice steady as he told his staff that the enemy still believed this was a police action, not a war, and that their greatest advantage was not firepower or numbers, but the fact that humanity had planned for defeat so thoroughly that victory became inevitable once the enemy made the first mistake, a mistake the Federation had just made by assuming Earth would react like every other world they had conquered, not realizing that humans had spent centuries studying their own history and learning one brutal lesson, above all others, that survival belonged not to the strongest or the most advanced, but to those who prepare to be underestimated. The Federation command structure began to fracture not with explosions, but with uncertainty, as reports from forward sensor nodes contradicted one another, and no two officers could agree on where the human ships actually were, because they did not advance in clean, declarative formations Federation doctrine favored, but in dispersed, overlapping paths that shifted constantly, forcing alien targeting systems to recalculate so often that firing solutions expired before weapons could be released, and on the flagship Koroth watched his tactical display fill with ghost contacts that appeared and vanished, each one tagged with probability estimates instead of certainty, which was something Federation officers were not trained to tolerate, because their wars had always been exercises in inevitability, yet now inevitability seemed to be slipping away as the first true exchange of fire began, and human long-range strikes arrived from beyond expected engagement envelopes, impacting escort cruisers with kinetic penetrators that did not glow or flare, but punched through holes with brutal efficiency, killing ships not by overwhelming their shields, but by exploiting timing windows and shield cycling that human analysts had mapped from passive observation alone. And as damaged vessels drifted out of formation, Federation captains demanded permission to withdraw and regroup. Permission Koroth denied because withdrawal signaled weakness, and weakness invited rebellion among subject systems. While on Earth, Laura Mitchell stood before a curved display showing casualty projections that had already dropped far below worst-case estimates. Her expression controlled as she relayed updates to civilian leaders who struggled to reconcile the calm tone of her briefings with the reality that humanity was now engaged in open interstellar war. And she reminded them that this moment had been modeled for generations, that hidden shipyards in the asteroid belt and beneath lunar regolith had existed for precisely this contingency, that the reason humanity had never appeared aggressive beyond its system was because it had chosen patience over provocation, and patience had bought time to study alien psychology, time to develop asymmetric doctrines, and time to accept that if contact ever turned hostile, there would be no room for hesitation. And as Federation assault wings finally reached low Earth orbit, they found themselves facing atmospheric defenses that adapted in real time, missile batteries that shut down and reactivated elsewhere to avoid retaliation, interceptor craft piloted by men and women, whose call signs meant nothing to alien intelligence, but whose coordination was flawless, each pilot trusting the others implicitly, because they had trained together knowing the odds would never be fair. And in the midst of this chaos, a human vessel transmitted directly to Koroth's flagship, not with a threat, but with data, a compressed packet containing recordings of Federation campaigns against other worlds, annotated with casualty figures and strategic notes, followed by a single line of text stating that humanity had studied every one of these conflicts and had learned from the mistakes of those who fell, a message that enraged Koroth and chilled his senior staff, because it implied a level of preparation that went far beyond resistance and crossed into deliberate counter-strategy. And when he finally authorized full-scale bombardment of selected population centers to force compliance, the order was intercepted and neutralized before it reached half the fleet, as human cyber warfare units exploited redundancies Federation engineers had never considered vulnerabilities, inserting false confirmations and delayed execution loops until command cohesion collapsed into localized decision-making. And that was when the true human counteroffensive began, not as a single overwhelming strike, but as hundreds of coordinated actions across space and orbit, each one small on its own but devastating in combination, isolating ships, severing supply lines, and forcing Federation commanders to fight independently for the first time in their careers, while Admiral Pierce observed the unfolding battle and noted with grim satisfaction that the enemy had finally begun to understand they were not facing a rebellious colony or a minor power, but a species that had internalized conflict as a permanent condition of existence, and had therefore learned to think about war not as an event, but as a system, one that humanity was now methodically dismantling piece by piece. As the battle stretched into its third rotation, the Federation fleet no longer resembled a unified force that had arrived with such certainty, because cohesion had given way to survival instincts, and ships that had been designed to operate as parts of a rigid hierarchy now found themselves isolated, commanders making decisions without guidance while trying to interpret human actions that appeared contradictory on the surface, but were in fact tightly synchronized. And within this confusion, the humans pressed their advantage with relentless discipline, not rushing for a symbolic victory, but tightening pressure incrementally, forcing Federation vessels into defensive postures that limited their mobility and drained their power reserves. And on the flagship, Koroth listened as his advisors argued and clipped increasingly emotional tones about sensor ghosts, false telemetry, and weapons that fail without warning, And for the first time in his long career, he felt something, dangerously close to doubt. Because the enemy did not behave like any he had studied, they did not pursue fleeing ships with obvious aggression, but allowed some to retreat along carefully monitored vectors, only to intercept them hours later when reinforcements attempted rendezvous, turning escape into a liability. While on Earth, the human public was only partially aware of what was happening above their atmosphere, receiving carefully curated briefings that emphasized stability and defense. Yet among the military and scientific leadership, there was a shared understanding that this conflict would define humanity's place in the galaxy forever, and people like Dr. Alan Brooks, a propulsion specialist who had spent decades refining drives that could operate indefinitely without external resupply, watched telemetry streams with quiet pride as ships he had helped design executed maneuvers that no alien craft could replicate, not because they were faster, but because they were built to accept stress and failure as normal operating conditions, a philosophy born from centuries of human engineering, where systems were expected to break and crews were trained to adapt, and this difference manifested starkly when a Federation battleship attempted to ram a human cruiser after losing its primary weapons, assuming that mutual destruction would at least restore honor, only to find a human ship venting compartments and shedding mass in controlled ways that altered its trajectory at the last moment, leaving the Federation vessel to tear itself apart against its own structural limits, an incident that spread rapidly through Federation command channels and shattered the myth that humans fought predictably, and as losses mounted, Karov finally convened an emergency council of surviving senior officers, demanding options that did not involve total annihilation, and it was then that one junior strategist, his voice trembling, suggested that the Federation consider withdrawal and negotiation, a proposal that would have been unthinkable days earlier, yet now hung in the air unanswered, because every metric they had relied upon had failed, and even as they debated, the humans escalated again, revealing another layer of preparation by deploying non-lethal suppression fields around several crippled Federation ships, boarding them not with overwhelming force, but with small, disciplined teams who secured command decks and engineering cores while offering medical aid to wounded aliens, an action that confused Federation crews who had been conditioned to expect extermination, and when recordings of these boardings reached Karov, he struggled to interpret them, because mercy had never been a strategic variable in Federation war planning, yet here it was being used deliberately, not as compassion but as psychological pressure, demonstrating that humanity could destroy the fleet, but chose instead to control it. And as Admiral Pierce reviewed these developments, he warned his counterparts that this phase was the most dangerous because a wounded enemy might lash out unpredictably, but he also acknowledged that the Federation's greatest strength, its belief in its own inevitability, had finally collapsed, leaving behind an adversary that no longer knew what victory even looked like, while humanity, for the first time since leaving its homeworld, was beginning to define that victory not as survival alone, but as the establishment of a new and uncompromising reality for the wider galaxy. The collapse of Federation certainty did not bring peace, but dangerous vacuum where doctrine failed and fear filled the gaps, and in that space individual commanders began acting on instinct rather than orders, leading to scattered acts of brutality that only reinforced human resolve, as one isolated Federation destroyer fired on a civilian orbital habitat after misidentifying it as a weapons platform, killing thousands in seconds, an action that rippled through human command channels with cold clarity, and Laura Mitchell authorized a response that had been prepared but never hoped for, releasing restraint protocols that allowed frontline commanders full autonomy to neutralize hostile assets without escalation review, and the effect was immediate and terrifying in its efficiency, because human ships that had been shadowing Federation elements for hours suddenly closed in with decisive force, disabling the destroyer in less than 90 seconds and broadcasting a detailed reconstruction of its final moments across open channels, so no alien captain could claim ignorance of consequences. And this act marked a shift that even Admiral Pierce felt with a heavy sense of finality, because it signaled that humanity had crossed from demonstration to enforcement, and across the fleet human crews carried out their orders with grim professionalism, not celebrating or raging, but focusing on execution, while on the Federation flagship Karov watched casualty numbers climb, past thresholds he had once believed impossible, realizing that the humans were not improvising but following a layered campaign plan designed to degrade not just ships but belief itself, targeting symbols of authority, isolating leaders, and forcing the Federation to confront the moral cost of its expansion. And when a second emergency council convened, it did so under the shadow of intercepted communications that revealed unrest in distant Federation systems, subject worlds questioning whether the power that claimed to protect them could even protect itself. And this political erosion alarmed Karaf more than the tactical losses, because the Federation was built on the appearance of control, and without it the entire structure risked unraveling. While on Earth, the decision to release partial footage of the destroyed habitat and the human response ignited a somber unity among the population, protests ceased, partisan divisions quieted, and enlistment centers reported unprecedented numbers, not driven by hatred of aliens, but by a shared understanding that neutrality was no longer possible, that humanity's future was being decided far beyond the sky, and scientists, engineers, and logisticians worked around the clock to sustain the war effort, knowing that every hour mattered. And as the Federation fleet attempted a coordinated withdrawal to regroup beyond lunar orbit, they discovered another human advantage, that retreat paths had been anticipated and quietly prepared, seeded with surveillance nodes and interdiction platforms that turned escape into a slow attrition, forcing alien ships to choose between burning fuel to evade detection or conserving power and being tracked, a dilemma that steadily bled their remaining strength. And in one particularly telling encounter, a Federation cruiser surrendered outright after receiving a transmission from a human captain who calmly outlined the exact condition of its reactors, life support reserves, and crew fatigue levels, offering terms that guaranteed survival if compliance was immediate. And when the alien commander accepted, the recording spread through Federation ranks like wildfire, not because surrender had occurred, but because it had been offered with such certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided. And watching these developments, Pierce reflected on how humanity's long history of internal conflict had forged a strategic culture uniquely suited to this moment, one that understood power, not as domination alone, but as the ability to shape choices until the enemy saw only one viable path. And as the Federation fleet dwindled and its authority fractured, the realization dawned on its leaders that Earth had not been invaded for conquest, but had instead become the crucible in which the Federation's entire model control was now being tested and found wanting. By the fifth phase of the conflict, the Federation no longer controlled the tempo of events, reacting instead to human initiatives that unfolded with unnerving predictability. And even those reactions were often anticipated and countered before they could take effect, because humanity had begun to exploit not just technological gaps, but cultural ones, understanding that Federation officers were conditioned to seek approval from above, even when isolated, a habit that human electronic warfare teams used mercilessly by simulating command traffic that delayed decisions at critical moments. And this paralysis allowed human forces to consolidate captured vessels and intelligence with minimal resistance, while boarding teams documented Federation systems in exhaustive detail, transmitting insights back to Earth where analysts updated live doctrine models, refining tactics in near real time. And this adaptive loop widened the gap between the two sides with every passing hour, while Karaf, now operating from a diminished command group after abandoning the heavily damaged flagship, struggled to reassert authority over a fleet that no longer trusted its own sensors or communications. And when he ordered a concentrated strike on what he believed to be a human logistics hub near the asteroid belt, the strike force instead flew into a carefully constructed kill zone where human ships emerged from behind debris shadows and disabled engines with precision fire, capturing yet another group of Federation officers who were stunned not just by defeat, but by the absence of hatred in their captors, as humans treated prisoners with procedural calm, documenting names, ranks, and medical needs, a level of order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the collapsing Federation hierarchy. And on Earth, Laura Mitchell convened a secure session with civilian leaders and military planners, presenting projections that showed the conflict nearing a decisive turning point. Yet she warned against premature declarations of victory, reminding them that desperation could drive the Federation toward catastrophic actions, including weapons that might not discriminate between targets, and contingency plans were quietly updated to account for worst-case scenarios that would test humanity's moral and strategic limits, while public broadcasts continued to emphasize defense and restraint, maintaining a tone of sober resolve that prevented panic and reinforced trust. And within the Federation ranks, rumors spread faster than facts, stories of human ships that could not be tracked, of captains who knew alien names before introductions, of surrender terms that preserved life rather than erased it. And these stories eroded the ideological foundation that the Federation had relied upon to justify its expansion, because if humans were not the savages or primitives, the sixth movement of the war unfolded less like a battle and more like a reckoning. As the Federation's remaining strength bled away through hesitation and internal fracture rather than direct confrontation, and human commanders deliberately slowed their advance, allowing the consequences of the invasion to propagate through alien political networks. Because every intercepted transmission now carried doubt, governors questioned directives, admirals delayed orders, and once obedient fleets began prioritizing self-preservation over doctrine, while humanity's own forces maintained an unbroken discipline that emphasized control over destruction, a choice that baffled Federation analysts who still clung to outdated assumptions about conquest. And on Earth, this phase was marked by intense but quiet labor as diplomats, intelligence officers, and military planners worked together to map not just enemy movements, but the emerging shape of a post-conflict galaxy, knowing that victory without structure would invite chaos. And Laura Mitchell oversaw the integration of captured Federation data into a comprehensive model of alien governance that revealed a brittle hierarchy sustained by ritual authority rather than shared values, a weakness humanity now exploited by communicating selectively with regional leaders, offering transparency and restraint instead of threats. And the effect was cumulative as more Federation units stood down or requested terms, not out of fear of annihilation, but because the legitimacy of their mission had evaporated, and Fleet Marshal Karoff, increasingly isolated and operating from a dwindling escort group, attempted one final consolidation, issuing a broadcast that framed the invasion as a necessary act of order against a dangerous species. Yet his words rang hollow even to his own officers, because the evidence contradicted him, showing humans who honored surrender, protected civilians, and responded to atrocities with measured but undeniable force. And when a final skirmish erupted near the outer orbital zones, it ended not with a decisive blow, but with a Federation task group powering down weapons unilaterally, transmitting a request for ceasefire that included detailed logs of unauthorized actions by other Federation elements, an act that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. And Admiral Pierce, after careful consultation, accepted the ceasefire on the condition that all Federation forces withdraw beyond the heliopause and submit to monitored disengagement, a demand that carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew compliance was the only viable option. And as the Federation ships began to retreat, the human fleet did not pursue, instead maintaining a visible but non-threatening presence that underscored a new balance of power, while on Earth the announcement was met not with celebration but with solemn acknowledgement, as people understood that survival had been secured at the cost of innocence, and that humanity had crossed a threshold to which there was no return, and in distant Federation space the withdrawal triggered cascading political consequences, subject systems openly defying central authority, alliances fracturing, and long-suppressed grievances surfacing, all traced back to the moment Earth refused to break. And in private, Karoff reviewed the final reports of the campaign and recognized a truth that would soon be impossible to hide, that the Federation had not lost because of inferior weapons or numbers, but because it had fundamentally misunderstood its enemy, mistaking restraint for weakness and unity bore diversity for disorganization. And as humanity consolidated its defenses and prepared for an uncertain diplomatic future, one fact became clear to all who observed the aftermath, that the invasion of Earth had ended the age of unquestioned Federation dominance, replacing it with a new reality in which humanity stood not as a conqueror, but as an unignorable force whose patience had limits, and whose response to violation would reshape the stars. By the seventh phase of the campaign, the galaxy was no longer watching a battle between equal powers, but witnessing a methodical dismantling of an empire's credibility, as human forces continued to consolidate control over orbital lanes, supply nodes, and communication relays while deliberately leaving no impression of occupation. And this careful strategy amplified the perception of inevitability, because alien civilizations that had once obeyed Federation dictates now questioned whether compliance guaranteed protection or simply delayed exposure to human judgment. And on Earth, Admiral Pierce coordinated simultaneous operations across multiple theaters, each one designed not just to neutralize remaining Federation assets, but to create a demonstrable pattern of disciplined efficiency that would be recorded, analyzed, and remembered by every sentient species with access to the transmissions while Laura Mitchell and her staff worked with captured Federation officials to begin constructing neutral zones and safe passages, embedding human oversight into frameworks that were transparent yet uncompromising, teaching alien leaders that authority could no longer be claimed through fear alone. And as the remaining Federation commanders attempted to coordinate a withdrawal through contested space, they encountered human interdiction networks that did not destroy, but immobilized ships temporarily, allowing boarding parties to deliver terms and technical assessments, a tactic that simultaneously reinforced human superiority and minimized unnecessary loss of life. And these operations were accompanied by a deliberate psychological dimension, with human communicators releasing select footage of precision maneuvers, rescued prisoners, and captured command data, all curated to demonstrate competence, control, and restraint, eroding morale among the aliens who had previously believed themselves infallible. And as the strategy unfolded, Koroth found his fleet fragmented, not just physically but ideologically, with captains refusing orders, governors negotiating independently, and communication chains clogged with requests for clarification on policy that could no longer be enforced. And when a Federation Council convened to address the crisis, they discovered that the humans had anticipated such political infighting, having already prepared engagement protocols that treated fragmented opposition as manageable variables rather than catastrophic surprises. And as a result, every attempt at coordinated Federation response only reinforced the humans' position, because they responded with measured force that punished insubordination while leaving compliant elements intact, demonstrating both capacity and magnanimity. And this combination of overwhelming tactical awareness and strategic patience culminated in a series of operations near the edge of the inner system, where human ships intercepted retreating Federation units, disabled weapons, offered terms, and recorded compliance, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And through it all, humanity continued to operate as a single, coherent entity, its internal hierarchy intact, its objectives clear, and its public messaging consistent, contrasting sharply with the disarray and indecision consuming the Federation, until finally the realization spread among alien observers that the humans had not merely defended their homeworld, but had systematically rewritten the rules of interstellar engagement, proving that patience, preparation, and disciplined adaptation could overcome overwhelming conventional power. And in private briefings, Pierce reminded his commanders that this was only the beginning of a new era, one in which humans would no longer be underestimated, because the galaxy had just witnessed a species whose resilience, intelligence, and moral resolve had created a standard by which all future conflicts would be measured, leaving Federation leaders to reconcile with the bitter truth that their assumptions had failed catastrophically, and that humanity, far from being predictable underdog they had dismissed, had emerged as an unassailable force capable of dictating terms to the very architects of its attempted subjugation. The eighth and final phase of humanity's response to the Federation invasion solidified not just victory, but a transformation in galactic dynamics, as the remaining alien forces completed their withdrawal under terms dictated by humans who had established clear boundaries, monitoring systems, and contingency protocols to ensure compliance. And throughout this process, every human action emphasized strategic foresight over brute force, with orbital patrols maintaining surveillance without, initiating unnecessary confrontation, while communication networks disseminated carefully curated reports to every Federation system, demonstrating restraint, technical superiority, and the consequences of misjudging a species that had long prepared for possibility of war. And as former commanders of the invading fleets returned to their home systems, they found political structures destabilized, populations questioning their leaders, and alliances fractured, a ripple effect of doubt and reconsideration that spread more effectively than any weapon strike, while on Earth Admiral Jonathan Pierce and Defense Coordinator Laura Mitchell oversaw the integration of captured technology, analysis of alien tactics, and preparation for future diplomacy, all conducted with the same methodical precision that had guided the defense from the outset. And human society adapted to this new reality with a mixture of pride, caution, and resolve, knowing that survival had been secured not through luck or brute power alone, but through decades of planning, adaptation, and disciplined execution, while scholars, engineers, and military leaders documented every lesson for future generations, establishing doctrines that would prevent the kind of underestimation the Federation had committed. And in Federation space, the psychological impact was profound, As surviving leaders acknowledged that their empire's assumptions about civilization, aggression, and compliance had been fatally flawed, and that humans could not be treated as any other conquered species because they combined technological ingenuity with moral coherence, strategic patience, and the ability to coordinate across entire planetary populations in ways the Federation had never anticipated. And as the galaxy adjusted to this new hierarchy, human forces quietly withdrew from forward positions, leaving occupied systems with governance structures designed for stability, demonstrating that power was most absolute when exercised without cruelty, and through it all humanity established a precedent. That underestimation is fatal, restraint is powerful, and a species that learns from its history can reshape the future of the galaxy itself. And as the last Federation vessels crossed the edge of the system, monitored but untouched, Earth remained intact, prepared and unbowed, a symbol and a warning, proving that humanity had not merely survived an invasion, but had decisively rewritten the rules of Interstellar engagement, leaving every alien civilization that observed the outcome to understand, with no room for doubt, that they had misjudged the human race, and the consequences of that misjudgment would echo across the stars for generations to come, ensuring that from that day forward, humanity would never again be underestimated,